Ladies and gentlemen, we now start our last session for today and look at China-Middle East trade. Please join me in welcoming our moderator, Dr. Linda Marta. You have the floor.
I'm delighted to chair the last panel for today, which deals with China-Middle East trade, country case studies. As we have figured out from the earlier discussions and presentations that the China-Middle East relations are as old as the two ancient civilizations, and the relations are so diverse between the two that they range from economic and commercial to political and financial, as well as to cultural ties and cooperation. With that in mind, we look forward to hearing from our esteemed speakers who will share with us their work and views in relation to China-Middle East relations, as well as the recent petrochemical development in the GCC. I'd like to welcome our first speaker in this panel, Mr. Mutlaq Al-Murshid, who is the Chief Executive Officer at Tasnee, one of the largest Saudi diversified industrial companies with investment in several fields. His presentation is on petrochemical industry in the GCC. May I pass the floor to you, Mr. Al-Murshid. Thank you.
Thank you. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. It's a pleasure to be here, coming from a visit to Canada 2 weeks ago at Edmonton, where the temperature was minus 30, to a temperature of plus 30 is quite good. Of course, being from Saudi Arabia, we're used to the heat, so it's okay. We can handle the heat. This is pleasant for us. It's not so hot. Temperature in Riyadh sometimes can reach 50 degrees, so that's fine. Singapore is a great place. I've been here many times. I was involved in opening the SABIC office here 25 years ago, which a company I was the chief financial officer, the third largest chemical company in the world. Now changed companies, of course, but at that time, Singapore was a different place 25 years ago. But due to your excellent infrastructure and excellent tax regime, SABIC at that time decided to open its Asian headquarters here in the city of Singapore, which was really a compliment because SABIC has lots of choices. It's a huge operation, was like over $15 billion of operation in this part of the world. I mean, China, Asia, all of it together. So with that, I would like to really thank the Middle East Institute for asking me to talk to you today. I'm afraid this presentation is not going to be your typical geopolitical or controversial politics or anything. It's just a typical business as usual presentation, talking mainly about the chemical industry, where we in Saudi Arabia specifically and the GCC in general have quite a strong position in that industry and do a lot of business actually here in Asia. The other things for me, being an Arab, it's nice to be in Singapore. There's a lot of the names I can read without a problem. Being of an Arabic names, let it be streets or shops or souks or whatever. So it's quite nice to have that kind of feeling. And you can walk around and you can see a few mosques. So it's quite nice. It reminds me of home. So with that, I would like to basically start with an overview of the chemical industry. I'm aware it's the last session. So people are tired, so I promise not to go over time. So I'll keep it. I will cover firstly a general view of the industry, so we'll give you a flavor. The industry actually started long time. Actually, first wave was the Germans, started by basically scientists, was developed when the Haber-Bosch invented the ammonia process technologies or process, which produced ammonia, which was in a way needed for ammunition for World War I and fertilizers later on. So that was significant. In the 1920s, Fischer-Tropsch developed the gasification process, which is widely used in China, mainland China, widely used. Unfortunately, for that process, it produced a lot of CO2, which nature took millions of years to take CO2 basically into solid carbon through trees and so on. And unfortunately, this process does turn it into back to CO2, although this process was developed under war. So it was needed for the German rubber and so on industry. So it has a different history related to it. Then came the Fischer-Natta catalyst, which basically enable the plastic industry as we know it today. So polymerization was developed for polyethylene, polypropylene, and as you can see around you in this room or in your car, it's full of that stuff. So that's the whole thing. Then from there, President Reagan, bless his soul, did the deregulation in the US industry that actually created a huge revolution of chemical plant buildup, especially along Gulf Coast in places like Houston and Louisiana. That big expansion. Even today, most of the US industry is gas-based, although there is some liquid. When I say gas-based, it's mainly methane, ethane. We call it in our lingo C1, C2 chemistry. And then later on, we switched to heavy, naphtha, and so on, because the gas was not available. Then the shale gas revolution came in, went back to that kind of its basis. Third wave of the chemical industry was actually created by Saudi Arabia back in the late 70s, early 80s. The government of Saudi introduced the master gas gathering system. Before that, huge amount of gas was flared. If I was a kid in Dammam, you can read and do your homework on the light of the flares. There is amount of gas, huge amount of gas being flared. Government collected that, then here comes the new wave of the chemical industry around the 90s, late 80s, 90s, 2000s. So that reached, and now we're getting into another wave with US back into the shale gas and China into coal to chemical, although I will cover coal to chemical. It's a little bit problematic. If you see what happened today, the size of the industry, as the industry today is like a $4 trillion industry, so it's quite huge industry. Anywhere you can see around you there is some chemistry in it, including our own bodies. So wherever you go, there is chemistry somewhere. And you can see that the industry growth has been significant. You see the latest course up to 17, huge growth in China, huge growth in GCC, rest of Asia, Latin America to a certain extent. But from now on, you'll see another wave coming in North America, both in the US and to a certain extent in Canada, where you see the impact of shale gas. So it's an industry 4 trillion, and it's going almost another 6 trillion, another 5, 7 years, you will see a 6 trillion mark. If you look at the GCC share of the chemical industry globally, we have quite a large, really for a small part of the world, population-wise, area-wise, quite big, but it's mostly desert. But luckily for us, that desert is useful because it has oil under it. So that's a bonus, like they say. So it's a big industry. It's an 84 billion industry in the economy and the revenue. By far, Saudi Arabia is the large gorilla in the room. So it's the big player in the industry, creating 78%. Saudi Arabia alone make over almost 100 million ton of chemicals, surpassing lots of countries, including Japan and others. So it's quite a big industry in our region. If you look at the Middle East and gas, we're quite big. This does not include shale gas, which is just starting in places like Saudi Arabia. So I won't be surprised if this picture will change in the next 5 years or so. So this is basically conventional gas, meaning no fracking. Somebody was mentioned the word fracking earlier. It's mostly conventional, the old way you drill a hole and you get gas, or in case of Saudi Arabia, gas comes with oil. So really, oil companies are looking for oil. Just gas happens to be with it, which is a freebie, basically. So that's the game. If you look at the price of gas, Middle East by far, from 2004 and before, no competition. Gas in Saudi was $0.5 per million BTU, simply because the oil companies make all the money in oil. So actually, they thank the people who take the gas, otherwise they'll be flaring. And with the government master gas gathering system, forbid flaring. So oil companies said, come and take it. We don't want to deal with it. And even today, if you go to Canada, where I was, actually in some places in Canada, they pay you to take the gas. Because that's fair. The name of the game is the oil. They want to take the oil, and they cannot flare also by the Canadian law. So they'll be happy to pay somebody to take the gas. And that's what I am, being the somebody who would like to take the gas in Edmonton. So you see the, the things going on up on the left-hand side. There was an uplift back in around, so gas today went from 50 up to 95 in Saudi, 50 cents a million BTU, then went to $0.75 or 75 cents a million BTU, around 95. Then recently, about the beginning of between 15, 16, went to 1.5 for C1, ethane, and $1.75 per million BTU for ethane. So methane and ethane. And the right hand is the price of propane. Saudi propane is ratioed to naphtha in Singapore used to be many years they've gone with that. 80% of propane price equivalent to 80% of the naphtha. And you see sometimes our price actually overshoots the US, but purely after when the shale gas came into play. Before that, always propane in the Arabian Gulf, which Saudi Arabia and the Emirates are the big player of the game, was always below the US. We now in the ethane, if you look at Mount Belvieu sometimes goes to 2, 3 things. We are in the 1.75. So there's still, but the US has the advantage of having the market. We don't have the market. We are an export-oriented industry in the Middle East or the Gulf countries, Saudi Arabia in particular. So we have to ship over long lanes. Our friends, our competitors in the US, they have the market at home. So that's quite convenient. And now with the shale gas, they're actually exporting. So when they export, of course, they're going to run the same problem we exporters have. You know, you run into taxes, you run into things. Luckily for the Americans, they have the agreement with the EU. They don't pay taxes. We pay 6.5% into the EU to enter the EU. We don't have bilateral agreements. Unfortunately, one of the speakers was talking about China's GCC agreement. Unfortunately, we business people don't like it. But unfortunately, it's not our choice. Those politicians have not agreed. So we pay taxes. The American, of course, when they come to Asia, they pay some taxes. But in Europe, they don't pay taxes, and they prefer Europe. So the competition is at height between the Gulf producers and the Americans are actually in Europe, especially the American producers on the Atlantic side, like in Pennsylvania and to a certain extent back to the south, Houston and Texas, Louisiana. So these are what's happening at the moment. If we look at the added value, I don't want to spend so much time because I know the time. So just I want to highlight the bottom line of the weighted EBITDA. You see, basically in this industry, if you go to the feedstock, it's 74 billion, drops to 31 billion, 12 billion, a total of 127 billion, which is the GCC, mostly from Saudi Arabia. But basically, the name of the game, money is made upstream. That's it. Where you go farther upstream, you make the money. The more you go down, you get start very tough. Because in the chemical industry, as a company, I only come to your country for 2 things. No political, no religion, no color, nothing. I want either feedstock, that country has a feedstock to provide at a competitive price, or I want market. That's I can sell. You know, if you look at the situation around the world, in Asia, you have the market, you have the financial to a certain extent technologies. Unfortunately, you don't have the feedstock in general. If you go to Europe, similar things. You have money, you have technology, blah, 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 but you don't have the feedstock. Middle East relies heavily in the beginning on American/European technologies. Now it's developing its own, but it has the financial, it has the feedstock, but it doesn't have the market. You go to America is the only exception. The Americans are lucky, our friends there. They have the market, they have the technology, and so on, and they have the feedstock with the shale gas. So that's what makes the American competitors, they are very formidable. So anyway, what I'm just saying, money is made upstream. If you apply that to oil, by the way, oil refineries, I used to work in a refinery in Houston, Texas many years ago. Refinery don't make money. It's just the oil company's way to get the crude oil from the field to the gas station. And they'll be happy to give a refinery to anybody, but they're stuck with it. The money made in the gas field. Same with iron ore, same with aluminum, anywhere. Money tends to be on that left side of the things. If you look at the late 90s, the GCC regulators really started the industry. The gas project in Saudi Arabia, clear regulation in the countries like Saudi Arabia itself, the development of industrial cities like Jubail and Yamba. It's nice, actually. I worked in the US, I worked in Europe. Most of the industry developed historically, and some close to town, some even very close to town, and grew, and houses, and so on. In Saudi Arabia, it was nice. You have a piece of the desert. As an engineer, it's a dream. You put your map, you do the thing, do everything. Here comes houses, here come whatever, here come port, here come the industry. And you always put the houses upstream wind, so any smell doesn't go to the houses. But if you're in Europe or America, with old established industry, you don't have that luxury. And that's why the Gulf, especially Saudi industry, grew as mega. We were the first people to build the crackers exceeding million ton. At that time, nobody heard of an ethylene cracker going over 1 million ton. Today, of course, they're over 1.6 or so. So I'm getting a message, so sorry, ladies and gentlemen, I'm gonna talk a little bit quick. So if you look at the regulators in the GCC, again, develop this thing. Now they're pushing for the liquid side. When you crack lights like C1, C2, C1 mostly goes into methanol or urea production. And C2 goes in ethylene, but the downstream derivative is very light end, we call it in our lingo. So you have to go farther down in the C1, C2, C4, C5, 6, and so on to produce the butadiene and other stuff. And so regulator now they're pushing that. If you look at the, the specialties success is where you are in the market. If you're gonna, Sabic, where I used to work, sold basically every iPhone in your pocket, every piece of plastic in it is made by Sabic. You can do that by having facilities, not the resin itself, but having the facility of conversion in China. That's where the stuff is made. But the raw material doesn't come from China. It comes from US or Saudi Arabia, where Sabic plants are located. So that's the kind of game. In the upstream business, you put your chemical plant where the feedstock. In downstream, you put it where the market. And you can see, if you can't beat them, join them. So what happened over the years with the gas being less and availability in the Middle East and the Gulf countries, especially Saudi Arabia, all the players of Sabic, Adnak, and so on, they moved outside. Sabic bought GE Plastic, 2007, bought DSM Chemical in Europe, and so on. And the Qataris did some, and the Emirati did some. So you see a huge jump that where the Gulf producers actually now producing a lot in Europe and North America and in Asia. Sabic has huge facilities in China. Tasni', my company, has some facilities in China. So everybody is going also. So if you chemical, for the jobs, unfortunately, the chemical industry is capital intensive, but not labor intensive. So it's a big in the GDP picture. We do like 6% or so of the Gulf countries. But unfortunately, in the labor side, we're less. It's not like the automotive or the steel or aluminum or something. That's the nature of it. But it's a huge added value. It pays high benefit, high salaries. So it's a very nice industry to have for any country. But you have to have the stuff to have it, to keep it in your country. In summary, has been pushed for time, and apology again to move quickly. The GCC players are now facing a number of challenges. One of them, the competition with our friends, the Americans, because of the shale gas situation and the American bilateral agreement and tax treaties with different countries around the world, which unfortunately in the GCC we don't have. Like I said, Europe, we pay 6.5. American and Europe pay 0. So that's an advantage. The competition from coal to chemical coming from China, but that's, in my opinion, is limited because you're going against the law of physics. What took nature millions of years to turn into carbon, you're gonna just do it in a split second back to the air and produce a lot of ash and so on. So for a while it's okay, fine. But after a while, I think even the Chinese now are slowing down significantly because they need to breathe. You cannot fill the air with the stuff. So, and then that's happening. And then now in the Middle East, the big one, or at least for the GCC, is the limited of availability of feedstock. So the next step for us, actually, and we've been lobbying our governments, is to price naphtha, which we export lots of it around the world, into attractive price, so crackers can be made to crack naphtha rather than gas. And that will actually create another huge wave of petrochemical expansion, both in Saudi Arabia and the Gulf countries. And I'm sure that will come. At the moment, there's some kind of talk, but sooner or later that has to happen. and you will see a huge expansion of that industry. So I do not take so much of your time. Unfortunately, we're running out. Thank you so much for listening, and pleasure with everybody. Thanks a lot.
Thank you, Mr. Al-Murshid, for this interesting insight about the challenges of the petrochemical industry in the GCC. I am pleased now to introduce our second speaker, Dr. Altay Atli, who is a lecturer at the Department of International Relations, Koç University, Istanbul, and the title of his presentation is Turkey's View of China as an Economic Partner. May I welcome you, Dr. Atli? Thank you.
Thank you very much, and a big thank you to Professor Ho and the whole staff of Middle East Institute for having me here. It's always a pleasure to be in Singapore and in US. So I'll be talking about how Turkey approaches China as a partner in economic relations, and yes. So, all right, okay. So there have been some problem with, because these weren't the colors I chosen, but anyway, so the information is there, right? So something has shifted, but nevertheless. Okay, all right. Turkey's view of China as an economic partner. So when we talk about this, the first thing that comes to the foreground when we talk about Turkey's economic relations with China is, of course, this. And again, I apologize because something has probably shifted because I switched from Mac to PC and I had to convert from Keynote to PowerPoint. So this is a bit unexpected, but anyway, you have the information here. So there is a big and widening here trade deficit. Up there you see the Turkish imports from China, and down there you see the Turkish exports. So there's a trade deficit. Turkey's trade with China is increasing, and so does its trade deficit, and it's a big problem actually, because Turkey has a current account deficit. It's a big problem for the Turkish economy, and well, you know, Turkish current account deficit is around $40 billion recently, and Turkish trade deficit with China is almost half of it. So problem. But then again, if you look at the investment side, it's growing, but it's still at the early stages. Turkish investment in China, Turkish FDI in China is around more than 200 million. But here, Chinese FDI in Turkey is more than 1.5 billion. It's much more than that. It's much more compared to Turkish investment in China. These figures are actually probably higher because I have taken them from the central bank, and central bank, well, they provide the officially registered capital flows. They don't include the retained earnings, reinvested earnings, or investments through third countries, but it gives you an idea. And some of the larger corporations of China have already invested in Turkey, including Huawei, including two banks, including Alibaba. Okay, so given this picture, how do the Turks, how do the Turkish government, how does the Turkish government, how does the Turkish business community approach relations China as an economic partner? I have some quotes here, one from the Minister of Trade, which says, basically, I'm not going to read them all, but basically they are saying, we have this trade deficit, so we have to get more investment from China to establish a balance. A diplomat from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, whom I interviewed myself, he says, well, we have to do everything that we can because that's a must. We have to get more investment from China. So Turkey is making efforts to have more balanced economic relationship with China. And there's a move from the rhetoric, a rhetoric that has been going on for many years. So it was always about how do we close the trade deficit. But as we said that, you know, I was myself included in some negotiations years ago between Turkey and China. So we were going to Beijing, meeting with MOFCOM and telling them, so you should buy more from us because we have to close this deficit. Now this is changing to, okay, we can live with the deficit, but we need to get more investment from China. Yes, and you can see this also in the recent, the government's approach in the recent action plans issued by the Turkish government. For example, Minister of Trade has designated China as a priority market. There is also an item about facilitating the use of local currencies between Turkey and China instead of dollar or euro. Minister of Treasury targeting Chinese financial market in order to achieve greater diversification in partners and instruments of external borrowing. So we are borrowing money. Turkey depends on external funding. So why not getting more from China and getting more tourists? Okay, so here comes the Belt and Road Initiative, the BRI, into the picture. So Turkey, well, the geography tells us, maps do tell us that Turkey has a very important position along the route of the BRI, and Turkey wants to capitalize on this. And in this sense, BRI is seen as a tool for facilitating investment from China. Again, some quotes. President Erdogan, he is saying that Turkey matters a lot for this for this project, and also a representative from the business committee, the chairperson of the largest business association of Turkey. She says, we are between China, Central Asia, and Caspian and Europe. So, and Turkey we do offer the shortest and the most feasible route here. The Turkish focus here is on the development of infrastructure, physical infrastructure, and mainly transportation and logistics infrastructure. And this is also very important for Turkey's long-term sustainable economic development as well, because Turkey does have a gap in infrastructure investment too. So Turkish infrastructure industry is growing. And if you look at the transportation infrastructure, here it's more about railroads. It's more about increasing the share of railroad transportation in both cargo and passenger. And the aim is to increase the total length of Turkish railroads from 12,000 to 35,000 by the year 2035. And that requires, of course, some funding. 45 billion worth of investment is needed here. So, so why not working with China? Given the focus within the BRI itself on the railroad connectivity, so why not working with China? Well, China is already a player in the Turkish railway sector. They have done parts of the Ankara-Istanbul railway line and also other segments. And there's also growing interest from the Chinese side, and it's not just interest. There are actually agreements signed between the two parties, like memoranda of understanding on, for example, the Kars-Edirne Railroad, which is a $35 billion project. This is connecting Turkey's easternmost point, Kars, on the Armenian border with Edirne on the westernmost point of Turkey, connecting Turkey's border with Greece and Bulgaria. So this will span the entire length of Turkey. And there is the interest. There are the first steps taken. There are already some outcomes on the ground, and there is also the legislative framework being completed. 2 agreements signed between Turkey and China. One on aligning the Silk Road, aligning the BRI with Turkey's Middle Corridor project, which aims to connect Turkey through the Caspian to Central Asia with Baku-Tbilisi-Kars railway, which started operations last year at its heart. So actually, I see it actually like pieces of a jigsaw puzzle. So you bring the pieces of puzzle together, like Baku-Tbilisi-Kars was one piece, now Kars-Edirne another piece, the ports other piece, and you get the whole picture of the BRI here. Also, another agreement, railway cooperation and land transportation. It's not only about railroads or land transportation, it's actually about intermodal, combined transportation. Well, because you need the combination of different modes of transportation to get your goods from China to Europe or from point A to point B. So Kumport near Istanbul is one of the largest container terminals in Turkey, and this is also the largest Chinese investment so far. COSCO Pacific has purchased 65% of this, and they are investing every year to improve the capabilities. But 3 more reports are in the pipeline. They were also mentioned by President Erdogan when he was in Beijing last year for the Belt and Road International Forum. One is Chandarlı near Izmir. This is right across the sea from Piraeus port in Athens, and the port of Mersin and the port of Zonguldak. And well, it appears that, and I'm saying this as a result of my talks with both business people, logistics people, and Navy people, like retired admirals to be precise. So the idea here is that Turkish ports can actually complement instead of, not substitute, but complement Greek facilities in this part of the world, strengthening the maritime logistics network between Europe and Middle East and Asia. So it's about, again, bringing the pieces together for an entire network in Eastern Mediterranean. And I think Mersin will be more and more important when it's time for the reconstruction of Syria, because it's very close to the Syrian border. Okay, China is a technology partner for Turkey. So the idea is working with China, Turkey can actually close its gaps, well, help to close its gaps in infrastructure, but also technology, because Turkey needs to improve its technological capabilities in order to sustain its growth. So can China be a partner here? So FDI enabling transfer of technology and co-production is preferred here, including FDI. We see this in energy sector, in addition to projects in solar energy, hydro energy, coal and renewables, which are already ongoing. There's increasing momentum in nuclear energy cooperation between Turkey and China. So this includes the establishment, construction of a nuclear plant, but also many different things that are included in the nuclear progress, including the training of Turkish nuclear engineers. But then again, this is all about diversification. Now, Russians are building the first nuclear plant in Turkey, and Turkish nuclear engineers are at the moment being trained in Moscow. The second one the second plant will be established by Japan, and now they are laying the foundation of the Turkish-Japanese Technical University near Istanbul. And third, it will be with China. We have examples from the defense industry. There was this missile defense system tender where Turkey decided to talk to the Chinese party in addition to NATO partners, Americans and Europeans, for purchasing, for the procurement of missile defense system. Here the idea was, well, if the Americans and the Europeans are only giving us the final product but not giving us the technology, well, if the Chinese are offering this, then why not? And telecommunications, well, Huawei, ZTE, very much active in Turkey, and so they are not facing obstacles in Turkey like they do in other parts of the world, in America, in parts of Europe. And they are also investing heavily in research and development. Huawei has its second largest research and development laboratory outside China in Turkey, in partnership with Istanbul Technical University, and there are many engineers, Turkish engineers being trained there. Okay, concluding remarks. So we have this trade deficit, and we learned how to live with this deficit. This is not going to close. And actually, trade deficit, fine. I mean, Turkey is a country suffering from a current account deficit, but trade deficit with China, you really can learn how to live with it, because one thing, as long as the costs are staying low, it is improving the purchasing power of the Turkish consumer. The second thing is Turkish producers depend very much on imported intermediary products. So we buy the pieces from abroad, then we put them together and sell them to other markets. So then China is a source. So you can live with this. But given this picture, in order to establish a more balanced economic relationship from China, which will not only employ investment that will not only bring Chinese money into Turkey, but also, and more importantly, which will help Turkey to close its gaps in technology, know-how, energy sufficiency, and infrastructure. So the focus is on, drawing more investment from China, and BRI is considered within this picture. So there are, of course, well, fine, so far so good, and the Chinese are coming to, the Chinese investment is coming as well. So far so good, but of course there are also, I mean, nothing is perfect, so this relationship is also far from being perfect. There are some issues. Well, to start with, there are serious differences on the Uyghur issue. For those who are not familiar with this, Uyghurs are the ethnic Muslim Turkic minority living in Xinjiang Uyghur Autonomous Region, and of course there's a huge diaspora elsewhere in the world. China is concerned about the activities of the so-called Eastern Turkestan, I don't remember the name, but an organization with separatist tendencies. And this is undermining the mutual confidence and trust between the two sides. Now, it's not that Turkey is supporting the separatists, but what you have been probably following the detention centers and everything that is going on in Xinjiang region. So this is one thing. And the other thing is, Turkish government says, we want more rights, less oppression, more cultural rights, economic rights, and so on for the Uyghur people. So the thing is, although despite the growing dialogue between the two sides in recent years, there are always question marks in people's minds. The Chinese are thinking, they are suspicious whether the Turks are somehow supporting the separatists, the terrorists, and so on. And the Turks are thinking, what are they doing in these camps? So are they like banning Ramadan fasting and so on? So I think there needs to be more dialogue between the two governments on this issue. Unfavorable mutual perceptions at the societal level in both in Turkey and China. This is, somehow ongoing. You go to the street in Turkey, ask people about the Japanese, the Koreans, they say, oh, very good, very nice, but when you say China, probably related to the first item. So mutual perceptions need to be improved. Similarly in China with respect to Turks. Political instability in the region, which forced the policymakers to divert their energy and attention elsewhere. And okay, we want to do more China, get more investment from China, do technology together with China and so on. But the question that we need to ask ourselves in Turkey, do we have enough institutional capabilities for this? You want something, but you need the institutions, you need the human capital and everything. So they need to be improved too. Finally, my final remark, I always get the question, whenever Turkey gets closer with China, I always get the question whether Turkey is moving away from the West, whether Turkey is breaking away, and whether it is having a shift of axis towards China, towards the East, away from the West. So, well, if you look at the economy, it's simply impossible for Turkey's economic relations with China or the Asia-Pacific in general to reach the level of relations with the West in foreseeable future because Turkey is too much anchored in the West. You have the huge volumes, and if I give you the FDI volumes, 70% of FDI in Turkey is from Europe, just 1% is from China. You have 4 million strong Turkish diaspora in Europe who have business links with Turkey. And, well, you have geography, proximity, and so on with Europe. So what Turkey is trying to do is diversify, not to put all the eggs in the same basket, in the Western basket, but to diversify so that when you have problem with one basket, not everything gets broken. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Atli, for this thought-provoking presentation that emphasizes the importance of engaging BRI in long-term investment rather than short-term financial flows. I think it's now time to hear from our third speaker, Professor Hu Bingbing, who is the Qatar Chair Professor in the Middle Eastern Studies at Peking University, and his presentation is on China, Iran, and the Middle East. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and also special thanks for Anson to invite me for this conference. It's always a great pleasure to visit Singapore. So first, I want to talk about how to understand the Middle East. There are some new features of the Middle East, or we can call a new Middle East is emerging. There are three main camps now in the region. There's a very clear Shia camp with Iran as a core country. There is a pro-Muslim Brotherhood camp. We can see the role of Turkey and Qatar. And also there's a third camp consisting of Israel, Saudi Arabia, and UAE. It defines itself as an anti-Iran and anti-Muslim Brotherhood camp. And there are four main competitions. We can call it strategic competitions in the region. First, there is a Turkey-Iran competition over the leadership in the Islamic world. It's non-confrontational. The two parties understand they should limit this competition only in Syria. So they keep high-level visit exchange. They keep the trade relationship. They have all the cooperation. Now even in Syria, they have some kind of cooperation. And the second competition is between Iran and Saudi Arabia in the Gulf region. It's comprehensive and confrontational, including different dimensions like domestic political system, like foreign policy, regional security, social, cultural, religious, and also economy and technology. So it's not sectarian. Many people claim that this kind of Saudi-Iran tensions is a sectarianism, but it's not true. As I said, it's a comprehensive, confrontational, strategic competition. The third one is the pro-Muslim Brotherhood camp and the anti-Muslim Brotherhood camp. We can see the tensions between Turkey and Egypt. We can see 2 years ago the Qatar crisis. It reflects, to some extent, this kind of contradiction between the two camps. And the last one is inter-Arab competition. The most important one is the competition between UAE and Saudi Arabia. So I was in UAE for the last 2 years and for the Abu Dhabi strategic debate. So I saw different voices. 2 years ago, the UAE people claim there is a Saudi-UAE axis in the Arab world. But last year, it has changed to be the core role of UAE alone. So it's very clear UAE has some ambitions in the region, especially in the Horn of Africa and East Africa. So, besides the traditional regional powers like Iran, Saudi Arabia, Egypt, Turkey, Israel, we can see the emerging role of rising powers like Qatar and UAE. So I think this is a new situation we have to face. So to deal with this situation, I think China and US have different approaches. First, US want to have alliance with the countries in the region, but China only want to have partnership. And I think US has taken side with some parties in the region, but China want to have balanced relationship with everyone. China has a no enemy or all friend approach in this region. And then US policy in the region has very strong military and security dimension, but China more focus on the economic dimension. So I think for China, the presidential visit to the region in 2016 was extremely important. During that time, China and Iran, Saudi Arabia and Egypt has either established or strengthened the comprehensive strategic partnership. And last year in May, Chinese president made a visit to UAE, and also the two countries agreed to have comprehensive strategic partnership. And then just last month, the Emir of Qatar, Sheikh Tamim, made a visit to China, and also the two parties decided to strengthen the relationship. And there are two documents are very important I want to mention related to Chinese policy to the region. First is China's first Arab policy paper, which was released in January 2016. And then the keynote speech made by President Xi during his visit to the headquarters of Arab League. Although there's no clear Chinese strategy or any document has mentioned that, but still we can find some elements of this Chinese policy toward the region. First is China support a cooperation with great powers outside the region, in the region. Like China had have some kind of dialogues with the US in the framework of China-US strategic dialogue, but it has stopped. It's a pity. And China doesn't take side, as I mentioned. So it's very clear during the crisis between Iran and Saudi Arabia 3 years ago, and also Qatar crisis 2 years ago. China support a kind of regional security and economic cooperation mechanism because the lack of this kind of mechanism makes the problems even more serious. Even the people want to talk, they don't find a place to sit down and to talk to together. And then I think China always insists in the political principles like the respect of sovereignty, territorial integrity, non-intervention, especially non-military intervention, and to have a political and diplomatic solution of the problems. And China focuses on economic cooperation, and there's a more and more security and military cooperation with the region. In regard of BRI, I think especially for GCC countries, there is always a concern that China has bypassed the GCC countries because it's in the end of any physical network of transportation. It's not a corridor between East and West. And also GCC countries are worried that China take Iran as a main partner in the region and support Iran because Iran can be a partner for China against the US. I think it's over-exaggerating of all this because China, as I said, prefer partnership. So BRI could be understood as a network of partnerships with either the countries in the region or the international organizations in the region, and also is a network of projects. So as long as BRI is not a physical road network, so as long as there is a project acceptable for both sides, I think China would have close cooperations with the countries in the region. So currently we can see some industrial park or industrial zone projects between China and the countries in the Middle East. First, we can see the Suez Canal Development Zone, and then we have the Duqm zone, and also Khalifa Harbor in Abu Dhabi, and also Jizan Industrial City in Saudi Arabia. And also Kuwait has also suggested a kind of 5 islands projects and also 6 city projects to China. So it seems that China has a lot of projects in the framework of BRI with GCC countries, very clear. And then I want to talk about Iran. It's very clear that for President Trump, Iran has become the center of his policy in the Middle East. So there are 2 tracks, I think. First is US is targeting Iran itself, and then US is trying to push back Iran in the region. So to target Iran, we can see the sanctions on the oil sector of Iran and also on this financial payment arrangement. And I think for Iranian side, they regard the Trump administration's policy as a kind of economic war or a kind of psychological war. So I think for the Iranians, they respond in this way that there's no solution of this huge pressure, economic pressure on Iranian's economy, but this pressure cannot make Iranian's economy collapse. And Iranian's efforts would make this economic problem is not transferred to kind of social crisis. So I think for the Iranians, September, October in last year was the most difficult time. The currency exchange rate and also the pressure of inflation, everything was in the peak. But after the sanctions have been imposed in early November, I think the psychological impact has going down. So now I think the currency exchange rate is stable. $1 for at about 110,000 riyal, something like that, and the Iranian economy, is still, survive. And also, I think for the Iranian support of their regional partners, it's very clear that the whole expenditure for the Iranians to support their partners in the region is only about 5% of their GDP. So it means that the U.S. pressure on the Iranian economy will not influence Iranian support of their regional partners. And also, I think for Iranians, they have begun to design some kind of strategic framework to face the U.S. pressure. Like, they began to use the term West Asia instead of Middle East, because Middle East is a independent region. There are no need for any integration with the other part. But as a part of West Asia, there's an intention to have an Asian integration to make Iran more linked with East Asia and North Asia, like China, Russia, India, and the other Asian countries. So this new approach, would influence Iranians' foreign policy and long-term strategy to a large extent. For actually, Iran is not always a key problem between China and U.S. But U.S. always brought Iran to these bilateral relations to have pressure on China. So because of the sanction, China has reduced its import of oil from Iran, and also Kunlun Bank stopped, for a period of time of their processing of transactions between China and Iran. So to find a new payment channel or to think about to use the Europeans, is alternative one. If China cannot continue to buy the Iranian oil, if the payment is always in difficulty, we cannot believe that the BRI cooperation between China and Iran would be successful. So there are a lot of challenges. And Iranians always mention one case, Chabahar harbor issue. Actually, they want to link Chabahar because Chabahar has got an exemption from the US side. Indians, Japanese have been deeply involved in that. So Iranians come to China to see whether China can also have a deep involvement in Chabahar development project and also link Chabahar with Gwadar in Pakistan. So I don't think it's on the priority of Chinese projects of BRI, and China till now has not involved in the Chabahar harbor development project because for Chabahar it's more like a corridor for Central Asian countries and Pakistan to the Indian Ocean. It's not a part of Chinese relationship with this region. And for Qatar, I think it's very clear that 2 years ago, because of this Chinese not taking side position, we didn't involved in this Qatar crisis. And Qatar, has faced big difficulties in the first month of this crisis. Like they have to find out alternative of the supplier of the commodities and also the alternative of transportation routes. And also there's a decreasing of foreign investment, especially from KSA and UAE. And also the exchange rate of the currency has changed also great. But I think after paying not low price, Qatar has stabilized its economy. As I said last month, Qatar Emir Sheikh Tamim has made a visit to China, and two parties agreed to have cooperation on BRI in 4 main fields. First is energy, especially LNG. In 2008, China and Qatar have signed a contract to import Qatar LNG in the amount of 5 million tons a year. And then in September 2018, CNPC signed another contract with Qatar Gas to import another 3.4 million tons of LNG every year for 22 years. So LNG is always, a key resource of revenue for Qatar. So Qatar wants to have a long-term strategic partnership with China as a main supplier and a main customer. The second field is the infrastructure. Chinese companies have been involved in the Doha harbor and also the main stadium of FIFA 2022, and certainly other projects. The third field is investment. There are branches of Chinese banks, Bank of China, ICBC in Doha, and also there are 2 Qatari banks have branches in Shanghai. One is QNB, another one is Doha Bank. And also 4 years ago, China and Qatar have signed some agreement to have a joint investment fund with the value of $10 billion US. And Qatar really want to have more cooperation with China in this regard. And the last field is high technology. After the Qatar crisis, Qatar really began to think seriously about to have a process of industrialization, especially based on high technology and also on this knowledge, to establish a knowledge-based economy. So in this regard, I think we have to mention this Alipay and also WeChat. All this payment mechanism have been used in Qatar. You can find this in the duty-free in Qatar Doha airport. And also beyond that, I think the measures by waiving the visa for both countries have give a good opportunity for Qatar to attract Chinese tourists to Qatar. They want to show, Qatar is different from UAE, from Dubai, from the other GCC countries, that you can have, your special interest in Dubai and in Doha. And also, I think there are talks about counterterrorism cooperations between China and Qatar. Certainly, I think, many professors and scholars have mentioned Chinese cooperation with Saudi Arabia and UAE. We can find the similar procedures between China and UAE. So I think there's a challenge that the GCC countries, especially Qatar, UAE, Kuwait, to some extent even Oman, try to have the same development strategy. So if there are similar things, how China deal with all this demand, and then how China balance our relations with the different countries, I think this would be a challenge for a long run. Thank you very much.
A huge thank you to Professor Wu Bingbing. I will now open the floor for questions. Please identify yourself, your name and affiliation, and please keep your question short and brief.
Okay. I have two questions. First, I'm from Peking University, called Beijing University. My name is Wang Suolao. I have two questions. First, given to my colleague from Saudi Arabia, Mr. Mutlaq. Second question, given to my colleague from Turkey, Dr. Atla Ali. For my first question, you give a very informative and detailed speech. I much like it, interested. But the problem is now in China, just as my colleague Wu Bingbing already mentioned that, since recent years, the negotiation between China and the GCC free zone discussion stopped, especially since 1.5 years ago, the crisis between 4 countries and Qatar. Now in China, we look at GCC, it's a divided bloc. We separately have a different policy to different GCC countries. So, just generally speaking, when GCC is not so meaningful for China. Currently, so my question is, Saudi Arabia is a very rich country, not only crude oil, but also natural gas. But for a long time, I don't know why Saudi Arabia refused to join gas exporting forum. So maybe even UAE already joined. Maybe just because the headquarters in Qatar? I don't know. Maybe you can give the answer. My second question to my colleague from Turkey. You mentioned that China is an economic power. Actually, this is a common consensus. Recent years, I met so many Turkish students, Turkish professors, Turkish officials in Beijing, even in Turkey. They all think China as economic power, but few people think China is a global power. So the problem is here. At the same time, Turkey wants China to invest and to hope to join One Belt One Road. Even Turkey, give its own corridor plan. But at the same time, Turkish government recently, frequently, in Chinese side, Chinese eye created some problem. Yesterday, your foreign ministry gave remarks. So from Chinese side, we think if you want to co-power invest so much money to help you and to give you a lot of things, you at least respect China's interest in the Middle East. So the different perception from your side, from our side, maybe this is the gap, is a problem for the cooperation of the two countries. So my question is, how Turkish people look at China as a political power in the Middle East? Thanks.
Okay, thank you. I think I can answer the question simply in 2 parts. First part, I really never worked in government in Saudi or outside Saudi. I'm a private sector guy all my life. I agree, the division in the Middle East and the GCC doesn't help with the negotiation with China. We business people on all the GCC countries have been lobbying for many times to have not only with China, but with the EU. The EU is the same situation. So, but what can I say? There's nothing we business can do to influence government other than lobbying. So that's the answer to that. The gas, in the chemical industry, in the GCC, we have a committee called GBCA, Gulf Petrochemical and Chemical Association. We have done studies many years, 30 years, the added value of gas to the economy. For each dollar we spend on the gas, we add $8 to the economy. Therefore, the answer simply, why export something that you can utilize at home and add $8? So export it, you get $1. You convert it to something else, the multiplier in the economy is 8. So frankly, have no incentive to export whatsoever. Saudi Arabia, for sure, we're not going to export unless it becomes so much swimming in gas or something. Qatar has a different case, because only gas, and Qatar is a small, you know, what 200,000 people, something, you know, you cannot do, I mean the locals, I'm not talking about the expat in the country. So yeah, certain places they can if you have so much surplus, but in the rest of the GCC, like the UAE or Saudi Arabia, we add huge value to our gas. So why throw gold over the fence to the neighbors? Keep your gold in your house. Thank you.
Thank you for the Thank you for the question. Yes, well, in my last slide, when I said that one of the challenges that we are facing in all of this is that you know, unfavorable perceptions between Turks and the Chinese, like Turks not really knowing much about China, and the other way around, of course, and therefore this leading to misunderstandings, misperceptions, unfavorable perceptions, and so on. Now, if you ask me what the Turks will think about China as a power in the Middle East, I would say that, you know, many of the people would ask what the Chinese are doing in the Middle East in the first place. So not really much knowledge about China's global role. Well, one thing, China is a big economic power, as you just said. As you said that, you know, I mentioned this. Well, this is of course agreed by everybody. But if you go beyond that, you know, this lack of knowledge, lack of the flow of knowledge between the two peoples is creating all kinds of perceptions. And because we have this Uyghur issue, because there is this Turkish Muslim minority, this makes the whole thing, the whole relationship more vulnerable to this kind of you know, misperceptions. So let me give you, I mean, I'm definitely sure you know it, but for the rest of the audience, let me give you the example of what happened in 2015, in the summer of 2015. So in 2015, suddenly, somehow, news began to circulate in Turkish media, especially in Turkish you know, social media, that the Chinese government is you know, oppressing the Muslims, oppressing the Uyghurs, and now it came to the stage that they are banning Muslim practice, banning Ramadan fasting, banning prayer in the mosque, even going to mosque. Then it went on. Photos began to circulate showing Chinese soldiers brutally you know, beating and torturing Muslims and so on. They were fake, of course. I mean, there is probably something there, like you know, limitations to fasting in civil offices, in public offices, and so on. But it snowballed into something which was very big and which was untrue. Now, and this led to demonstrations in Turkey, anti-Chinese demonstrations in Turkey, which went out of control. Demonstrations against Chinese missions, yes, of course, this is the first target, understandably. But also it went on like, it went ugly. It went ugly. And it only stopped. And this happened right before Erdogan's travel to Beijing. So, coincidence? Maybe, I don't know. I'm not going into conspiracy theories, but right before he went to Beijing to talk about BRI and all these things with President Xi, these things happened. And it was only stopped when he himself appeared on TV and he said, I'm paraphrasing, don't believe in everything that you see on TV. So this is the work of those who want to ruin our relations with China. What you have seen there is not true. And it, of course, it was really not true, actually. All those were fabricated. Now, but the question is, why do people believe in these things? Why is it so easy for us to believe in these things? And this here is Again, the lack of knowledge, lack of information. I mean, this is not only our fault, but this is also your fault. This is a mutual fault. So we have to explain each other's concerns, not only at the government level, but at the society level, much better to us. So the other day I had a meeting with some Chinese counterparts, and they were planning some events, public relations, and so on. And I said, okay, you will be coming here, and we will again see all the same things that we have been seeing, like explaining China, in the name of explaining China. Like, we will have calligraphy, we will have tea tasting, which are very nice. I totally respect this. But tell us about the new China. Tell us about the BRI. Tell us about, I don't know, what the Chinese youth are doing. Let us know the Chinese mindset better, because when people don't know, they can believe in things. So this is something that needs to be worked on, that needs to be improved, the mutual understanding between the peoples, because I think at the government level, I'm not representing the government, but I think at the government level, despite this interesting announcement 2 days ago, which might also be very much related to domestic politics, because elections are coming in Turkey. So I think there's better dialogue at the government level. What is more important is the society level. Let the Turks know more about China, and let the Chinese know more about the Turks. I mean, let's do it together, of course.
Thank you very much. My name is Shikata, Japan Forum on International Relations. Let me ask Mr. Mutlaku about Saudi Arabia.
Sure.
My original background is also petrochemical business, so I'm very glad to listen to your presentation.
Thank you.
I understand that China is going to link its own BRI with Saudi Vision 2030. And one of the key of Vision 2030 was IPO of Saudi Aramco, but it seems to be suspended. So will you tell me if Saudi Arabia has an idea to implement IPO in the near future? And if that's the case, what kind of role do you expect China to play? And if not, how is Saudi is going to secure enough resources for Vision 23? That's the first question. The second question is about petrochemical industries. I understand Saudi Arabia is one of the largest petrochemical industries, and many of them have joint ventures with Japan, US, EU, and so on. So if you're going to introduce new petrochemical industries with other countries such as China, how are you going to coordinate such new enterprises with each other? Or are you going to let them compete on a laissez-faire basis? Thank you.
Thank you. You know, the first one, I honestly cannot comment as much because I am not part of Aramco, never worked in Aramco in my life. I don't speak on behalf of the government, so I have no clue. The only clue I know as I get in the Saudi media as anybody can get about the listing being delayed or postponed, but at least the official story we hear in the media is been delayed but will be done, but I honestly have no clue. So it's not my area of knowledge or frankly interest. The only oil where I worked, I was working Shell in Houston, Texas in a refinery as a chief engineer, but that was way back in the 80s, so no clue. But we chemicals, I can talk, which we are downstream of the oil, of course. They are our supplier. Sometimes we love them, sometimes we hate them. So it depends where the price is going. So for the Bitchem, as you said, all the JVs are really negotiated with private companies. The only set from the state in Saudi Arabia is the gas price or the feedstock, propane, butane, light naphtha. That's a government state price that gives to everybody, Chinese or Japanese or American or whoever. So the negotiation becomes between the SABICs of the world, my company, Tasni' of the world, where we have JVs with Lyondale, Dow, Evonik, and all kinds. And it's done in market basis. If you can, offer the best things with the Saudi companies, or you can do it alone. Some companies actually in the market is open do it alone. So it's not, the price set is not dedicated only for Saudi, but any also foreign company can enter and play the game. So it's not restrictive, so it's no competition. But there's technically competition in the product, When we make the product and sell it, then we compete. Like I compete with Sabic, my old ex-company. And of course, being a mid-size, I don't compete with a big gorilla in the game, otherwise I get crushed. So I try to avoid the elephants in the room, and so on with the other companies. But the price is, in the market set, and you open, Chinese or whoever can do whatever the game. And Chinese are now doing a project in Jizan, to my knowledge, in chemicals actually, downstream in chemicals. So they're already entering in the market.
3 more questions.
To Professor Big, please. The figures I read is that China's purchase of Iranian oil is down around 20% and will probably grow. What significance do you attribute to that? And then Iran is seeking investments of over $100 billion, in fact closer to $200 billion, in development of its South Pass gas field, etc. Do you think China will consider stepping in? Thank you.
I think, as I mentioned, China has reduced our import of oil from Iran. Actually, I think this time U.S. has adopted a different policy from Obama administration. That during Obama administration, the sanction was there, the waiver was there, but the waiver was to country, not to companies. But this time, the waiver is to companies, that any company only after reducing its import from Iran oil, then they can get this waiver. So I think specific Chinese companies are facing big pressures this time. As a country, China will continue to buy oil from Iran. It's not a business issue. It's not pressure from U.S. I think it's a strong signal of Chinese independent foreign policy issue. And then you mentioned this investment. I think Chinese energy companies like CNPC, CNOOC, and Sinopec, all of them are very interested in the market of Iran, especially the upstream. So the South Pars is always a point of attention of Chinese energy companies. Still, I have to say, because of the U.S. sanctions and also U.S. pressures, it's still unclear how much Chinese companies could be involved in South Pars and also other projects, not only gas but oil.
Yes, I have a question for Mr. Mutlaq Al-Murshid. I very much appreciated your hard-nosed approach to your analyses, which basically is thinking on the basis of what works for me as a businessman and for my business, and bracketing off all the political issues. I think we need a lot more of that sort of thinking in terms of whether the BRI can or cannot work in the Middle East, because once you mix in the geostrategic, the political stuff, you lose analytical focus and rigor of logic. So I'm very happy that you've been consistently helping us think along this rigorous business lines. Now, along those lines, it was very clear. You said the money is made upstream, not downstream. But on the other hand, you yourself played a major role in bringing SABIC out to Asia. SABIC accumulated a lot of intellectual property, which allowed you to do stuff downstream and feed your products into the supply chains of Asia. Now, my question to you is, do you think that is saturated? Do you really think that all the money is made downstream, upstream, and value add downstream somehow that has reached a limit? Or can you help us think further on the basis of your kind of logic, whether there are comparative advantages, complementary comparative advantages between a place like Saudi or your company and Chinese or Asian comparative advantages that can be pushed further if the two come together?
Thank you. Thank you. A good point. I mean, I'm a private person. I run a private company, 100% publicly traded in the stock market. My shareholder didn't give a damn about what happened outside as long as I pay dividend. And the more of dividend, the more they're happier. Otherwise, they'll fire me. So, we're not into any games or any, road, railroad, BIs, whatever it is. It's our business is how we maximize our profit to our shareholders. Simple as that. When you talk about the upstream, downstream, I think as long as the world economies globally growing by 3 to 4%, there'll always be advantage maintained by the upstream guys. Unfortunately, in the upstream game, you have to enter the multi-billion-dollar game. You cannot, for example, enter the commodity chemicals with a cracker without having $10 billion in your pocket. And not too many people around just walk around with $10 billion in their pockets. So it's kind of barrier to entry, we call it in the business. It also can work against you sometimes. It's barrier to exit also, because you put that dumb amount of money, you cannot just walk away. And the difference in the downstream is you can actually enter quite cheaply, because the plastic conversion, like I gave the example of the iPhones or even the Samsung TVs, every part you see in that place is made by Sabic or Tasni'ah or somebody. But it's made the resin, because the resin you can ship in a 20-foot containers easily in ro-ro ships around the world. But let's say you make now a pipe from the plastic. You're going to ship a pipe. What you're going to ship is air. So you're going to make that pipe wherever the market is. But because it's just logistics. In our industry, logistic cost can be up to 30% of the cost per ton. So when you make toys, and the Saudi market and the whole GCC market, technically, our population is small. So, but if you're going to ship toys from the Middle East or the GCC, it takes a lot of space. So you're better off shipping resin and make a toy somewhere else, where the market is actually in your advantage. So that's how we look. At the end of the game, like I said, when you go downstream to an iPhone or a Samsung, you need to be in the market. If you go to the upstream, you need to be where the feedstock advantage is. There is not much middle for the chemical companies. They either have it that way or they cannot have it both, except we are joking about the Americans. The Americans, they can have it. Correct. Thank you. That's correct. That's a correction I should have said. Yeah, Saudi is entering the downstream game today, but not with the big boys. It's the smaller guys, the mamas and papas and stuff like that, we call them. I mean, I'm joking, say mamas and papas. These are the men of maybe 100 million, but you go to the Sabics of the world, 100 million. When I was CFO of Sabic, the guys in the office knew, if it's less than $1 billion, don't bother Mutlaq. It's true. If you move 100 billion, when the guy bother at 1 billion, it becomes the low-level guys, general manager level, vice president level, not the CFO level. So, it's downstream. Saudi is moving now significantly, but it is not with the big boys. It is the smaller, mid-size SMEs kind of guys taking advantage of the availability of the resin or availability of the chemical. Like we manufacture, not diaper, the super absorbent that goes in the diaper. So somebody go make diapers in Saudi, where we have a lot of kids, and do the market, and sell it into Africa or the other, and that's exactly what's happening. And so yes, it's happening.
I'm afraid we're running out of time. We can squeeze in one final question, please.
John Alterman from CSS. I have a question for Bing Bing. As I listened to your presentation, it struck me that compared to the other two, it was entirely state-focused. You talked about conflicts between states, you talked about relations between states, and what I took from Mr. Murashid and Mr. Alta's presentation was really the importance of the private sector, of sub-state actors, of businesses. I mean, Turkish business drives Turkish policy, not the other way. As an academic, as you think about Chinese policy toward the BRI, do you think China is in danger of ignoring non-state actors, of ignoring the private sector, of ignoring other forces other than state-owned industries and state actors as it thinks about how both economics and conflict and diplomacy will proceed in this region over the next 20 to 30 years?
I think for China, it's always a challenge to deal with non-state actors, not even in the economic field, but also in the security and political field. Like I have mentioned, Hezbollah in Lebanon is a part of the government. There are ministers who are who belong to the Hezbollah, but it's even difficult for us to have contact with those people and to have direct contact with Hezbollah. So it means that even on a political arena, it's difficult for us to deal with them. So how China can be easily to deal with the other non-governmental, non-state actors, I think is a long-term challenge. Let's take an example from UAE. There are about, some people say 200,000 or 300,000 Chinese in UAE. But this presence of huge number of Chinese people there didn't really increase Chinese knowledge on UAE. So although they live in UAE, they do business on different levels, but still, Chinese understanding on UAE is, I think, to a large extent, very limited. So what's the challenge from this? How China, from on different levels, could benefit from this, could make use of this wealth to increase our capability. I think is a challenge to the government, a challenge to our academia to think about the channels to do that, I think. You mentioned private sector, but I think the US always focus on Chinese SOEs, their operation in the world, like in Middle East or in Africa. So it seems that, even for the economic, in the economic field, the SOEs attract more attentions from the others instead of the private companies, I think. So it's a comprehensive challenge, I think, now in different dimensions, social, economy, cultural, I think. So you have raised a very important question. That's a question that we should answer and find a way.
Okay, on that note, let's conclude this session. Thank you all for your attention. It's been a long day for everyone. And a bigger thank you, of course, for the speakers. Please join me to give them a big round of applause.